You know, I'm a professor of law at Te Hanga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and I specialise in constitutional and government law. And I want to briefly address you specifically on the franchise and the exclusion of some people from voting, whether that's extending of the barriers to registration and participation or the blanket disqualification of prisoners. And I make this submission with a heavy heart, given last week was Women's Suffrage Day and more than 130 years since our society led the world in affording women the right to vote. Because our democracy flourishes when participation in elections is high. Our democracy flourishes when all the many people in our community have a say in who governs. And participation in elections fortifies the legitimacy of the resulting democratic government. These points are basic, but should not be lost sight of. And you've heard many already today express concerns about the substance of the proposed changes and how they risk tarnishing our democracy. And I echo those points. But in my time, I want to make another point about these changes. And here I invite the committee to pay close attention to and address in its report the conventional rules about the amendment of electoral rules. Electoral rules are precious. In the past, we recognised that significant changes should only be made to electoral rules when the changes are genuinely above politics and when they have widespread support or different combinations of that. And the Royal Commission's important report on the electoral system is sufficient reference for that. But you might also like to reflect on recent discussions about entrenchments too, which raises similar issues, and it's important that those dots are connected. The risks associated with parties in power redesigning electoral rules in their own interests are obvious, and the existing conventional rule warns against this. And in my view, these changes fail that convention. Secondly, into prisoner voting, the committee may wish to reflect on Parliament's proper approach when dealing with proposed laws or laws that the courts have signalled unjustifiably breach human rights as here. And I do worry that Parliament is formally and almost flippantly doubling down on the rights implications arising from the disenfranchisement of prisoners. Sure, legally, Parliament continues to have the full power to make laws and can make the change. Parliamentary sovereignty, no question about that. But as a matter of morality and civic conscience, when and how should it chart a different course, contrary to expert advice from the courts who have deeply grappled with the issue and provided advice? I don't think we can frame any convention in terms of a need to legislate in conformity or consistently with the advice, because parliamentary sovereignty does prevail. But I think we might expect at least deliberate good faith and principled engagement with the rights dimensions as elaborated by the courts. After all, this dialogical model that declarations of inconsistency sit in constitutionally arises from a belief and a commitment to what we describe as our culture of justification. Where's the justification? So something like a conventional rule that might be that might speak to how Parliament should grapple with laws that are subject of declaration of consistency with deliberately good faith, principled engagement, might be a useful working way to frame what I think should be a emerging convention if the committee wishes to speak to that in its report. I think there's a strong normative case for starting to at least begin a conversation about the terms in which Parliament may disagree with the courts based on justified and deep grappling with the issue at hand. And for completeness, I think it is clear that the threshold, that working threshold, does not seem to be met here. Kia ora, thank you.
Sorry, what was that last comment, Professor, about working threshold?
The working threshold. I'm floating some language around an expectation that Parliament deliberately, in good faith, and has principled engagement with the underlying reasons that have been offered by the judiciary to the Parliament in relation to prisoner voting.
Oh, so, Honourable Dr. Webb.
That's a really good and kind of conceptually, quite full submission. I'm just interested in your reflections. You've got the Attorney General saying some things, you've got the Department saying some stuff, and we've got a select committee process, and if you go through the submissions, you'll see they kind of go one way, pretty much. How does all this fit in? Because Paul Goldsmith seems to be taking the approach that, look, there is an issue. I'm the Minister of Justice. I can listen to you all, but at the end of the day, I think I take certainty and timeliness of result as being a fair trade-off. That's his view, right?
Yes.
Where does that sit within your convention?
I think the question, there is a chorus of voices in relation to rights consistency. I acknowledge that. Here, they're all pushing in one direction, as you say. And I think that fortifies the point that imposes a greater duty on the executive in bringing the legislation through the parliament and the parliamentary bodies in scrutiny, that there's an expectation of deep engagement. And I just don't think we've had that. I think what we've seen is almost, as I say, formal doubling down. And one just needs to look at the the Hansard in relation to debates on the first reading, for example. More is expected. Parliaments should elaborate very carefully, and the executive elaborate very carefully, and in engagement with the other bodies that are speaking on this issue and providing the advice why the point of disagreement.
The convention, because this is tough stuff, right? We have entrenched provisions.
Yeah.
Whatever you think about them, and then we have stuff which is just workaday law that the government can change if it wants. Are you saying the electoral law kind of sits somewhere in the middle?
I think the small subset of entrenched provisions is a very tightly defined important core. I think beyond that, there's quite obviously a number around the electoral provisions which shape the outcomes of elections in material ways, which are at risk of being gerrymandered. So that's where I think the discussion, this committee may want to investigate what are those parameters, pick up on some of the conversations that were undertaken at the Standing Orders Committee, for example, and things like that, about, because it doesn't make right. Just because there's a majority doesn't mean that power that Parliament has should be used in that way. You should be sitting here asking you, would I want my opposition, the parties opposed to me, in making changes like that in that way when I'm in the majority? So when is something genuinely above politics, and when should we recognise as a matter of civic conscience, a matter of morality, a sense of that there is just a right way to do some things? So I think that's an important dimension that this committee should actually just start to address in its report.
Right, Professor, we're going to have to call it quits, unfortunately, but thank you for your submission.
You're
very
welcome.
thoughtful again.